This is the 1-3 Properties of Numbers Study Guide and Intervention, the green sheet that we did in class. On the front side, there's just two problems using the identity and equality properties. And what they ask us to do is evaluate each expression and name the property we use in each step. So we're going to use the order of operations, which we learned in the last section. And so we're going to do the parentheses first, and then we use order of operations within those parentheses. And so we do multiplication and division first, and the first one that we run into is 3 times 5. And 3 times 5 is 15. Anything else we haven't dealt with stays the same. And that property is called the substitution property. And what that means is we've substituted in 15 for 3 times 5, because that's what it equals. The next thing that we run into within the parentheses is 15 times 1. That's the multiplicative identity. Any number times 1 is itself. So we're going to replace 15 times 1 with just plain old 15. And that's going to be the multiplicative identity, which I'm just going to write as multiplicative ID, and that's 15 times 1 is itself 15. The last thing to do inside the parentheses is 15 minus 14. That's going to be a substitution, and that will say 15 minus 14 equals 1. It's going to be substitution, like I said. And then, once we've gotten rid of all the stuff that's going on in the parentheses and we just have a number, we can do order of operations with the rest. And we don't have exponents, so we move on to multiplication and division. So the first thing we run into is 2 times 1, and that's the multiplicative identity again. Anything times 1 gives you itself back. And then, it might not look like it, but the next thing we have is 4 times 1/4. And 4, written as a fraction, is 4 over 1. So you can see that the fractions have been flipped. That's called the multiplicative inverse property. Anytime you multiply something by its inverse, you end up with 1. So we're going to have 2 minus 1, and that's going to be the multiplicative inverse. And 4 times 1/4 equals 1. And then the last step is a substitution. 2 minus 1 is 1. Alright, the next one, again we're going to start with the parentheses, and inside the parentheses order of operations says to start with 15 divided by 3. Everything else is going to stay the same because we haven't dealt with it. And 15 divided by 3 equals 5. and we're just substituting what that equals in. So that's substitution. Then the last thing to do inside the parentheses is 5 minus 5, and that's the additive inverse. Anytime you add the opposite or subtract the same from a number, it equals 0. So 15 times 1 15 times 1 minus 9 plus 2 times 0, and that's by the additive inverse. 5 minus 5 equals 0. Once we've gotten rid of the parentheses, we do the next step, which would be exponents, which we don't have, so we do multiplication and division. The first one is 15 times 1. Anytime you multiply something by 1, that's the multiplicative identity, and it equals itself. So 15 minus 9 plus 2 times 0. Multiplicative identity. 15 times 1 equals 15. And the next multiplication we run into is 2 times 0, and that is the multiplicative property of 0. Anything times 0 is 0. Multiplicative property of 0. 2 times 0 equals 0. And then, now that we've gotten rid of multiplication and division, we move on to addition and subtraction, moving left to right. The first one we run into is 15 minus 9, which is 6 by substitution. And the last step is the additive identity. 6 plus 0, anything plus 0 is itself. Additive identity, 6 plus 0 equals. So on this side, it is important that you do it step by step like this and write in what you're doing. So like in the red side here, substitution, 3 times 5 equals 15. That's what this side is working on specifically. So you may not just skip those parts and write the final answer. On the back side, we're using the commutative and associative properties to make mental math easier. So the first thing to do when I look at number 1 is get things together that make 10s and 5s nice and easy. So when I see 12, I'm looking for something that has an 8 in it that I can put it next to, because when I add those two together, I know I'm going to get a 10. So I'm going to reorder it as 12 plus 8 plus 10 plus 5. And each step we're supposed to identify the property used, and this is the commutative property, which I'm just going to abbreviate as COMM, commutative. Then we're going to group them and add them separately, and that is the associative property. And that says that the order that you add or multiply does not matter. Got to be careful when you're abbreviating the associative property. Make sure you put the OC at the end. Then we're actually going to do the things in parentheses. So 12 plus 8 is 20. 10 plus 5 is 15, and that's substitution. And then the last step we're going to do is 12 plus 15 is 35, and that's also substitution. 20 plus 15 is 35. All right, in number 2, we have 0.5 times 2.8 times 4. And with the 0.5, what I'm going to try and do is figure out what do I know easily what half of something is. And I know better what half of 4 is than what half of 2.8 is. So I'm going to reorder to put 0.5 and 4 next to each other. And that's by the commutative property, which says that order doesn't matter. Then I'm going to group them so that I do 0.5 times 4 first. And that's the associative property, which says how you group them doesn't matter. Then I'm going to actually solve for what's in the parentheses, and half of 4 is 2. That's substitution. And the last step is 2 times 2.8 is 5.6. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 8 is 1.6. Add those two together and we get 5.6. And again, that's substitution. Okay. In number 3, I see a decimal, and I really don't like working with decimals, so I'm going to see if there's a way to get rid of it. And I know that if I multiply a decimal like 2.5 times 10, what's going to end up happening is moving that decimal point out, so it'll be 25. So I'm going to change that into 10 times 2.5 times 7. And that's by the commutative property, where I can switch the order in addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. Then I'm going to group those two, so I do them first. So 10 times 2.5 I'm going to do first, and that's by the associative property. Now I'm going to do that multiplication. 10 times 2.5 is 25. So now I don't have my decimal anymore. It's a lot easier to work with, and that's substitution. 10 times 2.5 equals 25. And then the last step is to do 25 times 7. Well, I know that 2 times 7 would be 14, so 20 times 7 is 140. And 5 times 7 is 35, so 140 and 35 is 175. And that's substitution. That. All right, number 4. I see fractions. I don't like fractions. I'm going to see if I can make them go away. Well, I have 4.5 here, and I have another half here, and I know if I put them together, they're going to equal a whole. So I'm going to put them next to each other, and I'm going to say 4.5 plus 1/2 plus 5 plus 3. And that's the commutative property. I can change the order of addition and multiplication. Now I'm going to group them. So I'm going to say 4.5 plus 1/2. And then I'm going to add that on to 5 plus 3. And that's the associative property, which says I can group them in any way, and the answer will be the same. 4.5 plus a half is 5. And then 5 plus 3 is 8. And that's just substitution. And then the last step is 5 plus 8 is 13, and that's another substitution step. Okay. Then, in number 5, it's a little bit scary because I have more fractions and I'm multiplying. So I don't really see a way where I could just combine the fractions and get rid of them. But if you notice, I have a 7 and a 1/7. So if I put those two together, I know that by the multiplicative identity, or excuse me, multiplicative inverse, they're going to equal 1. So they'll go away. And maybe something good will happen when I multiply 1/4 and 16. So I'm going to group them in that way. I'm going to say 7 times 1/7 times 1/4 times 16. And that's the commutative property. And then I'm going to group them so that I do 7 times 1/7 first. And then I do 1/4 times 16 next. And that's the associative property. I can group them in any way. Like I said before, 7 times 1/7. 7, remember, as a fraction would be 7/1. So those two are reciprocals or inverses of each other. So by the multiplicative inverse, I get 1 when I do that. And then 1/4 times 16. Well, 1/4 of 16 means 16 divided by 4, which is 4. So my step there, the 7 times 1/7 was the multiplicative identity. And then 1/4 times 16 was substitution. And 1/4 times 16 equals 4. The last step is 1 times 4 is the, oh, excuse me, I wrote identity. I keep saying that. This is multiplicative inverse. And then multiplicative identity is 1 times 4 is 4. All right, in the last one, I have 2.5, 2.4, 2.5, and 3.6 all being added. When I see 2.5, I'm hoping that there's something else with a 0.5 that I can add to it. So I'm going to put those two next to each other. And also when I see 0.4, I'm hoping that there's something that has 0.6 so that when I add it, they equal a whole. I'm going to put the two things with 0.5 next to each other because they're going to add up to make something that's a whole number. And then I'm going to put the things with the 0.4 and the 0.6 next to each other because they will add up to be a whole. And that's the commutative property. Then I'm going to do the addition of the 0.5s first. I'm going to put them in parentheses. And then I'm going to do the 2.4 and 3.6 together by putting it in parentheses. And that's by the associative property. And then 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5. And 2.4 plus 3.6, well, the 0.6 from 3.6 would make 2.4 3. 3 plus 3 is 6. and that's substitution. And then the last thing, 5 plus 6 is 11, and that is also substitution.